love one another. Love one another as I have loved you. That's Jesus' imperative for all of us. It was his new commandment as he was on his way into Jerusalem and eventually the cross. Love one another as I have loved you. Doesn't sound overly complicated, does it? Love one another as I have loved you. Pretty simple stuff, and yet it's almost like it's been our lifelong pursuit. Really the pursuit of the entire Christian movement for the last 2,000 years. What does that mean to love one another as Jesus loved us? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're going to explore that question today. What does it mean to love one another as Jesus loved us? I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that we have to literally die for one another. Jesus does not command us to literally lose our lives for one another. Jesus does not. Now, I know there are people in this room and some of y'all online who probably would be willing to lay down your life for another human being. It's Mother's Day, for crying out loud. You think I'm going to argue with any mother who's going to say, Dr. Mark, you can't stop me from laying my life down for my child, my children. My mother made many sacrifices for me. But the important part is that Jesus does not demand it. Jesus does not require you to sacrifice your literal life, your physical being. In fact, both the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, and the New Testament are absolutely clear. Human sacrifice is wrong. Love one another as I have loved you does not mean you need to literally die for others. In fact, didn't Jesus say, I have come that you might have life and that you might have it in abundance? Didn't he say today in John's Gospel that his intention is that his joy would be complete in us, that we'd be filled with joy, that we'd have life and have it in abundance? Doesn't sound like Jesus is asking us to literally die. Sure, he did. He was on his way to the cross and he was willing to lay down his life for us. But he loved us in a whole lot of other ways, didn't he? And we're going to explore some of those ways in just a minute or two. But this is such an important thing for us to remember. How many times has John's gospel been abused, Jesus' words been abused to enlist people to go fight battles? Now, don't get me wrong. I am ever thankful and honor those who made the supreme sacrifice of their own lives to defend our freedom, to fight for peace throughout this world. But Jesus does not demand it. It's not the hook. Jesus does not demand that we literally die. His love is not one with that kind of string attached. Jesus does not ask us to literally die for others. Love one another as I have loved you. So what does that mean? Love one another as I have loved you. It's really fascinating to me, if you didn't pick it up. I haven't picked it up before, or at least haven't thought about it that much before until this past week, that Jesus does not say, love me as I have loved you. That's kind of interesting to me. Remarkable, really. When you think about it, we live in a world where a lot of people demand our love or demand our allegiance. Like my Facebook page, please. Follow me on Instagram, please. Did you see my latest YouTube video? Why don't you share it online so I can get more likes, I can get more follows? How about that? Jesus didn't say love me or like me or follow me. He said follow my way, follow my teachings. He did not demand that we love him back the way he loved us. It's remarkable to me that of all the world leaders that this world has known, Jesus is not asking for a vote. He's not asking us to donate to a political campaign. Jesus isn't asking us to buy the latest product, new and improved. No, his call is for us to love each other. It's amazing when you think about it. I mean, real love, true love, does not ask or demand that it get love back in return. The moms in this room, my mom, her mom, they didn't demand that their children love them back. It's a requirement. I loved you, so now you got to love me. I wiped your nose when you were little. I wiped places further south. And now you have to love me back. Doesn't work that way, does it? No, real love opens up a relationship. It creates an environment, a very personal, intimate relationship where love can be given and love can be received back and forth, and love can grow, but it certainly isn't demanded. It's not required. You know, down here in the South particularly, I hear more than I used to hear up north, but I heard it up there too. People would ask me, Dr. Mark, when were you saved? And often I think it was kind of code. If you could tell people when you were saved, they know you're a real Christian, a born-again Christian. They were wanting you to say, well, I was saved at Christian night at the baseball game, and we had someone give a testimony down on the field and invited people to come and give their life to Christ. That's when I was saved. Or maybe they're looking for an answer like, well, I was saved like Abraham Lincoln when I went down on my knees in prayer because I was overwhelmed by the conviction that I had no place else to go, and then I was saved. But it doesn't work that way, does it? Oh, that's maybe when we responded to salvation. To me, there's only one real answer to that question, when were you saved? And the answer is this: I was saved 2,000 years ago when Jesus Christ laid His life down for me. It had nothing to do with me and everything to do with Him and His love for me and for this world. In fact, if you were listening today to the reading of John's Gospel, chapter 15, verse 16, Jesus said, "You didn't choose me, I chose you." To think that we somehow could be the masters of our own salvation is just misplaced. So what does Jesus mean when He says, love one another as I have loved you? Well, the word that Jesus uses when He says, I have loved you and I want you to love others is this fascinating word called agape. You know, the Greeks helped us understand love in a variety of ways. They talked about eros, passionate love, heated love. They talked about philia, brotherly love, friendship love, Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. But there was also this very unique and rare word, and it was used in the Scriptures when Jesus spoke or when they talked of Jesus and His love, and the word is agape. It's kind of a selfless love, a love that gives itself away freely, no strings attached. No strings attached. You didn't choose me, I chose you. Imagine that. I want to tell you a story of a man named Hayden Carlow. Some of you may have a little bit of a vague recollection about Hayden Carlow. I hadn't thought about Hayden Carlow in a while until this past week when I was working on this text for this moment now. Hayden Carlow today would be probably around 34 years of age. But back in early December of 2012, Hayden Carlow was 25 years of age. He was married. He had children. He had a job. It wasn't a big paying job. He worked in a hardware store, but it was enough to kind of scratch together the pieces every week and pay the rent and take care of his family. Well, one day, Hayden Carlow's driving through Plano, Texas. He looks in his rearview mirror and he sees the blue lights. There's a police officer going to pull him over. And Hayden thinks to himself, oh my goodness, I know why I'm being pulled over. And I've got no excuse. I'm just going to have to throw myself in the mercy of this police officer, just give him the truth and see where it goes. So the police officer parks the cruiser, walks up to Hayden's car and asks for license and registration. The police officer says, "You know why I pulled you over today, Mr. Carlo?" And he said, "Yes, I think I do. It's because my registration has expired." And the officer said, "That's correct. Your registration has expired." He said, "Can you tell me why you haven't renewed your registration on your car, on your tag?" And this is where Hayden got real, and he got honest with this police officer. And he said, "Well, to be honest with you, officer, I couldn't afford it." He said, "I'm married, I've got children, we just barely make enough to pay the rent. And last month I was faced with a choice. Do I renew the registration on my car, or do I feed my children? I know which one I'd choose. I'd choose the same one Hayden Carlo did. I'd feed my kids." And I think that officer knew the same would be true in his own life. So the officer goes back to the cruiser, and he sits in the cruiser and he writes up a ticket for Hayden Carlo, comes back to the car, knocks on the window, hands the ticket through the window, and then says, "Listen, Mr. Carlo, would you please get the registration on your car renewed as soon as possible?" And Hayden said, "I'll take care of it as soon as I can, officer." And the officer gets in the cruiser and drives away. And Hayden, if you've ever been pulled over by the police, I imagine his heart's pounding. You've got to take a few breaths to, like, oh my gosh, I got a ticket. You feel terrible. And Hayden sits in the front seat of his car and he opens the ticket. He wants to see how much he's got to pay now, in addition to the registration on his car. Well, he opens up the ticket, unfolds the piece of paper, and you'll never guess what fell out onto his lap. It was a $100 bill. That officer wrote Hayden Carlo his ticket, but he also enclosed a $100 bill, enough to pay for the ticket and to pay for the renewal on his car's registration, about $50 at the time. Hayden said he sat there in that front seat and he wept. He cried. He got a ticket, but he also got mercy. And I thought to myself, when I read that story, this is an awful lot like God's agape love for us. There's judgment. You get the ticket. There is the truth of the gospel which calls us out, but there's also mercy folded inside. There's mercy and forgiveness and compassion so that we can be renewed to God. I thought to myself, that officer revealed to Hayden Carlo agape love. He showed that kid, that young 25-year-old young man, agape love. You see, agape love shows love to those who can't pay us back. Isn't that kind of like God's love for us? We who could not ever think we could pay God back asks us to love others in the same way. Love those in that way. Love those who can't pay you back. Moms, your kids, when you're loving those kids when they're little, you're not thinking they're going to pay you back someday. Oh, in our imaginations, or sometimes we joke around and say, one day you'll make it big and you can take care of me in my old age. One day you'll make it big and I can retire early. But there was no expectation that your kids would ever pay you back. Oh, when they got into college and beyond, just in case they're listening, you better believe there's an expectation of paying back from banking mom and dad. But really, there was no expectation of being paid back. That's agape love. You know, that police officer didn't expect Hayden Carlo to pay him back. He just wanted to help Hayden's life get back on track. Get the registration done, pay the ticket, and continue being a good and decent person to your spouse and your children. There was no expectation of repayment. In fact, when Hayden and his father went back to the police department because they wanted to return thanks, they wanted to say thank you back, the police officer said he wanted to remain anonymous. The media came, wanted to interview this police officer, lift him up, make him a kind of hero who kind of saved the day for Hayden. He said, no, I just did what was right. This young man needed help. That's agape love. No expectation of repayment. You know, when I was up in Cleveland, I often had homeless people, or people are really in dire straits. We're serving a downtown urban church, and a lot of people come in and they needed help big time. And sometimes we helped in ways that we could, sometimes small ways, take somebody for a bite to eat, sometimes in larger ways. Sometimes we help pay somebody's rent for 3 months, or we help pay their heat. It gets real cold up there in Cleveland in February. Help them pay their heat, help them pay their electric bill, help them keep going, just to help them out. And oftentimes people would be so appreciative, they'd say, Pastor, this is just a loan. This is just a loan. I'm going to repay you. I'm going to repay you, and I'm going to repay this church. And I said, listen, this is not a loan. This is a gift. See, the problem is if you think of it as a loan, you're going to think you always owe me something. And if you owe me something and you don't have the something you owe me, you're going to avoid me. I'm not going to see you because you're going to always feel like, I owe Giuliano or I owe the church. And no, this is not a loan. This is a gift. Because that's the way God loved us. God did not indebt us. Anyone who's ever lived with debt, you know how heavy a weight that debt can be upon you. God does not love us by putting more weight on our shoulders with debt. God does not expect a repayment, because the same would hold true, right? We would avoid God because we always feel like we owe God something. God's strings attached. We owe God something, and then we avoid God. No, agape love does not loan. Agape love offers gifts freely given. Jesus, a gift freely given. And Jesus asks us to love that way. Love those who can't pay you back. Love those who can't pay you back, and you're going to experience some of the joy that Jesus was talking about. Love people with an expectation, with strings attached. Not only do they have a string attached to them, you got a string attached to you. You're always going to have to manage that person or stay attached because the string is attached, right? I had a friend years ago, we'll just call him Mike, protect his anonymity here. So the church was working on a project, construction project, and Mike was on the committee. And at every meeting, we'd be talking about another step in the project, and Mike would say, call this guy. He owes me a favor. He'll give us a cut rate on this. And the next meeting, we'd be talking about some other element of the project, and he'd say, call so-and-so, he'll give you a good deal. He owes me a favor. I remember after 3 or 4 nights of this, I said to Mike, hey Mike, don't ever do me any favors. He didn't get it. He said, why not? I said, because I don't want to ever owe you anything. God's not the Godfather making us a deal but always have to repay. Agape love has no strings attached. Agape loves freely. Agape love is a gift with no expectation of repayment. That's the way Jesus wants us to love. You want to love like Jesus? Love like that. Agape love loves those who feel unworthy of love. Those who have lived with shame or guilt or a sense of regret. Or loving the kids even when the kids went down the wrong path, you still love them back. It'd take an awful lot for me to ever not love my kids. No matter how bad things got. And in my life, things didn't get too bad. Not in theirs either. But agape loves people even when they feel unlovable. Even when their bodies are failing them. Or their mental well-being is failing them. When their own capacity perhaps for love is failing them. Agape love loves anyway. Even when people feel unlovable. We love people who can't love us back, or people who don't feel worthy of love. In some sense, we at the very least maintain our own sense of humanity, right? I was walking downtown Montreal a number of years ago with a couple of friends from seminary. As we're walking down this street, one of the friends sees this panhandler ask him for money, and he reaches into his pocket and he gives the guy $1. And the other student says to him, "Why are you giving him money? He's just going to go drink it away." He said, "Why are you giving him $1? You think you're going to change his life?" And the first fellow says to the second, "I didn't give him money to change his life. I gave him money because he asked, and I didn't want him to change my life. I just do it because it maintains my humanity. It's because who I am, not because of who he is. That's how God is with us. God loves us because that's who God is. That's how God works. We love without strings attached. If we're going to love like Jesus, no strings attached. We love those who can't love us back, and we love even those who feel unworthy of love. But I'll tell you something remarkable that happens when we love those in our world who can't love us back, or who have never been loved without strings attached, or don't feel worthy of love or not. Something happens. I believe we end up restoring ourselves and them, not only to our higher humanity, but we restore ourselves and them to God. We reveal something about God's love and God's mercy when we love like Jesus. That's what we're about, right? That's how we know the joy that was in Jesus. That's how His joy is in us. We end up revealing something of God and God's love to those who've never experienced it, or those who have experienced it but only get a taste here and there because we live in a pretty broken world. We get to experience that kind of joy of helping to restore people's higher humanity, ourselves included, and restore people to God. You know what was remarkable to me yesterday? I went back and I Googled that story of Hayden Carlo. I hadn't thought about him in a long time. And I Googled it and found a number of articles about his experience with that police officer in Plano, Texas. And the media came to Hayden Carlo after the fact, and they asked him how he felt receiving that gift from that police officer. You know what he said? He said, "I will never forget what that police officer did." And get this. He said, "That police officer restored my faith in God." I was so moved by that. I thought, that can't be right. Well, he wants to say it restored my faith in the police, or it restored my faith in humanity. And so I Googled it again and found a few more articles, NBC, ABC. I found all sorts of articles, local articles from local newspapers. And you know what? Sure enough, his quote showed up in every article. "The police officer restored my faith in God." How about that? Jesus said, "Love one another as I have loved you. Go and bear good fruit, fruit that will last." And I think to myself, when that police officer exhibited agape love, he was bearing good fruit in the life of Hayden Carlo. I think it's been 9 years since that happened, and just the retelling of his story, I think it continues to bear good fruit, even in our lives, because it bears witness to this great, merciful, compassionate God who loves us without strings attached, who loves us even when we feel unlovable, who loves us even when we feel unworthy. Well, dear brothers and sisters, love one another. Love one another, just as Jesus has loved you. It's that simple, isn't it? Let's go do it. Praise be to God. Amen.